Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Monday, June 27th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 68 days, the game against Michigan in 152 days. The window for official visits has now closed for the month of June, and it was quite an eventful one for the Buckeyes. We got to see a total of 6 camp days, a 7-on-7 camp. Ohio State added a trio of elite players to the 2023 recruiting class in one of the greatest weeks in the program's recruiting history, and more could be on the way very soon. My guest today is Tony Gerdeman. He just wrote about some of the best weeks the Buckeyes have ever had on the recruiting trail and where the last 7 days stacks up. Tony, how's it going?
Tom, you froze up there for a little bit. You might want to check your connection. Other than that, things are going great. Thank you for asking.
So glad to have you here. So I was very excited to read that piece as well because it was I think a conversation that a lot of people were having last week. And then you went back and did all the research, and this is you ranked the 12 best recruiting weeks in Ohio State history. I think we kind of have to start by defining what we mean when we say history, because even the end of the John Cooper era is basically prehistoric when you're talking about recruiting coverage and recruiting rankings. So when we're talking about history, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, you do have some older recruiting rankings from that time that you can find on some cave walls and Olentangy caverns and things like that. But in terms of actual recruiting history, we're talking about basically since 2002 until now, when the sites were fully live and ranking, and also we're talking 2002 because that's all the farther the sites themselves want to go back through their own history. They don't go, they have more data, but they're like, no, 2002, that's it. That's how far back we're going. So that's how far back I went, and it's not easy to get that kind of information anymore, and it's disappearing. And you can go back and look at go look at Ohio State's 24/7 page, their commitment class in 2002. I don't even know if any of those players have star rankings by them, and then you go to a class in 2005, and maybe half of them do. So there has been some research done, Tom. It's not just one of these things where I just rattle it off. Yes, I did a little bit of work. Thank you for saying that. Did you say that, or did I say that?
You said it, but it is definitely a notable thing, so I'm glad you brought it up. And you talked about this in terms of looking back now. So this was not necessarily you can get a bunch of 5 stars in a week, and if they don't pan out because of injury or whatever else, that doesn't end up with a ranking near the top of your list. So if you go back and through history and just go purely by the total number of stars from committed players from any one week, then this week, 3 years ago, this same week, 3 years ago, is actually the best week in terms of total number of stars. That one hasn't really shown up on the field yet for the most part for a couple reasons, but who did they bring in 3 years ago this week?
Yeah, it was a 22-star week for the Buckeyes. They got commitments from Darian Henry Young, Cody Simon, Joe Royer, Mitchell Melton, Josh Fryer, and Cam Martinez. And so far to this point, Cam Martinez has started 1 or 2 games. Cody Simon has started a handful of games. Everybody else, Darian Henry Young is already gone. Josh Fryer is finding his way into the top 7 or 8 on the offensive line. Mitchell Melton had a good spring until he was injured in the spring game and was looking to do something this year. But yeah, overall, it's a group where one guy has sort of established himself, but he played injured last year, in Cody Simon. And when I was doing this, one of the things I wanted to do was rank them by stars. But as I said, the star rankings weren't listed on a lot of the years, so I couldn't go through it. But no, there was 6 commitments this week, I think. Not sure if there were any that had any five or more. I think that this was the biggest week in terms of numbers, and also these are all 3-4 star players, so the numbers add up quickly. But this is also an example, and there are other examples why you just can't necessarily go by the number of stars. And obviously they still all have a couple, 2-3 years left remaining, but stars is not the end all be all, Tom.
So you're saying stars don't matter? Do you
Oh,
need me to get Ari? Do you need me to get Ari on the phone? I can get Ari. I can get Ari Wasserman on the phone if you'd like to fight that one out. No, I think that was a very illustrative, example of why you can't necessarily do this in advance. You have to kind of look back in retrospect because Cody Simon has been banged up. Josh Fryer has been banged up. Mitchell Melton missed all of last year and is now likely to miss all of this year. I mean, and so these are guys who could be significant contributors in the future or this fall, but you just haven't gotten to see them yet. Cam Martinez has been kind of stuck behind some other pretty good players at that safety spot. He had a pick six last year. He started a couple games last year. It's not that these guys aren't going to turn into something. They just haven't necessarily turned into starters just yet. So we're going to go through the top 4 weeks in history, and just, the time of year when a lot of these happened is kind of indicative of how things have changed. I mean, we just talked about 2019 and all these guys coming in, and that was sort of at the end of the, summer visits, but in the 2013 class, which was number 4, this was February 4th through 10th, which, if you remember what the recruiting calendar was back then, it makes sense. But, that was in the heyday of National Signing Day. National Signing Day is now, sort of a distant second to early signing day. But, go through the top 4, go through guys from February of 2013, who they are, and why that was such a big week.
Yeah, that was the week that you had commitments from Ezekiel Elliott, who committed that April, but then kind of never decommitted, but reopened his recruitment, and it said he was deciding between Missouri, which is where his parents went, and Ohio State on signing day, but he recommitted to Ohio State. You got Von Bell that week, choosing between Ohio State and Alabama and Tennessee and others. You got Dontre Wilson, and then receiver James Clark, who didn't pan out, but you land Zeke Elliott, Von Bell, Dontre Wilson. The most Elliott gets the most acclaim there. Von Bell was an All-American, but it was Dontre Wilson who had the best freshman season of them all, posting nearly 1,000 all-purpose yards. So a very big week. Hard to imagine Ohio State winning a national title without that week happening.
Yeah, that is kind of a common theme of a lot of these weeks we're talking about, where you have a lot of these guys end up contributing to the national championship teams. Next one is another group that did that, another cluster of commitments, and that one was National Signing Day. This one, sometimes you see those cluster of commitments coming right after guys get home from the spring game. This was an April cluster of commitments. We saw that earlier this year with Bryson Rogers, Mark Fletcher, and Dijon Johnson all committing the week after the spring game. That was also the case 10 years before that as well. Who was committing in the week after the spring game in April of 2012?
Yeah, hard to beat the star power on this one. It was Joey Bosa, JT Barrett, the big two, and then Tracy Sprinkle, who built his career and was eventually a captain and got hurt later in his career. But you see the names Joey Bosa and JT Barrett, and those are two of the all-time greats in Ohio State lore. Joey Bosa was 2014 Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, was 2-time Defensive Lineman of the Year in the Big Ten, 2-time All-American, started as a true freshman. JT Barrett was 3-time Big Ten Quarterback of the Year, Freshman of the Year 3 times. He was all Big Ten, 3-time captain, Silver Football Award winner in 2016, and also 4-0 against Michigan as a starting quarterback. So those two guys, it's very difficult to beat them. It takes a lot to beat them, which is, I guess hints towards the classes to come.
Yeah, so those 2 weeks were both classes that really contributed to the 2014 national championship. The last 2, it's actually kind of one long extended week. It's like kind of a, take an extra weekend or so on the end, and you've kind of combined numbers 2 and number 1 here. But they were both crucial pieces of the early Jim Tressel team. So these were guys who were on the 2002 national championship team, ended up being bigger players later, but definitely contributors to that 2002 national championship team. There's obviously quite a bit of overlap here. But who were the guys from, let's start with number 2, and then you're going to hear some of the same names in number 1 as well.
Yeah, number 2 was January 28th, 2002 through the February 3rd. It was Bobby Carpenter, Santonio Holmes, Nate Sally, and Quinn Pitcock. That's 2 3-year starters, 2 2-year starters, 2 first-rounders, 3 all Big Ten selections. That's a bunch of starts in there, a bunch of production, and really it's just a small segment of that overall 2002 class, which was pretty insane when there's other names in there, Maurice Claret, not this week, but AJ Hawk, all of these huge contributors. But that was, that's bang and that's buck. That's quantity and quality that week for sure.
And then the next week, some of these guys overlap because this was, I mean, unquestionably the most insane 10-day or so stretch in Ohio State recruiting history. And you have judged it the number one stretch of a 7-day week in Ohio State recruiting history. Who was it in that group?
Yeah, that was also Bobby Carpenter and Santonio Holmes, but you swap out Nate Sally and Quinn Pitcock for Troy Smith. So it was Bobby Carpenter, Santonio Holmes, and Troy Smith in that 7-day window. And really, this was an 8-day window. That's what separates Troy Smith from Nate Sally and Quinn Pitcock. But yes, a week of Bobby Carpenter, Santonio Holmes, Troy Smith. You're talking 2 first-rounders, Heisman winner. Santonio Holmes goes on to be Super Bowl MVP. Bobby Carpenter, dealt with injuries in the NFL, but Troy Smith wins the Heisman, the Walter Camp, Silver Football. He was the first team All-American quarterback at Ohio State since Art Schlichter in '79. So there's another 3 guys, big-time star power, but it's kind of alarming, or it certainly takes you aback. That's a pretty big week.
Yeah, you put those 2 weeks together, and it's basically the entire core of that 2003, 4, 5 kind of Ohio State teams like that. Those were very good. That 2005 Ohio State team is one of the more underrated, I think, or maybe one of the more underappreciated, where they lost a couple games, but they lost 2 games to very, 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 very good teams, and had some really big wins. That dramatic comeback against Michigan just annihilated Notre Dame in that Fiesta Bowl in a game that was not nearly as close as that score indicated. I think they beat them by 14 in the Fiesta Bowl, and being there, it felt like that should have been about a 28-point win. Just, I think they had 617 yards of total offense, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but back then, oh boy, that was a lot of offense. And that was what was supposed to be a pretty good Notre Dame team, and they just got whooped that day. I guess the big question here, and this will be the title of the show, so I guess I'm contractually obligated to ask you, Tony, could last week be the best recruiting week in Ohio State history when all is said and done?
No, Tom. No, no. It's a very high, the star ranking. We say stars don't matter, but it's rare to get 2 5-stars and a 4-star guy in a week. And it has happened before. And some of those weeks, there was the Melvin Fellows, Dorian Bell week where you had 2 5-stars and there was another 4-star in there that I forget. But that is an example of it was a 14-star week for the Buckeyes. That is also an example of a 14-star week for the Buckeyes. But you have to like the way that Brian Hartline and the Ohio State staff have scouted receivers. And these are receivers that everybody wanted. It's not hard to look at the talent that they possess. This is an offense that is suited for receivers, even 3 of them. It's not just a one offense or one receiver offense. We've seen there's plenty of footballs to go for 3 receivers, and the way these receivers churn through and get in and get out in 3 or 4 years, I'm not going to say it will be or it is, but am I going to be surprised when it becomes that, when we look back on this show, Tom, in 2029 and we're doing this, hey, let's revisit some random show from 7 years ago. And no, I wouldn't be shocked at all. I'm not going to, I don't expect that to be the case, just because like you like to say, I'm never going to assume Ohio State is going to go 12-0 just because it's so difficult. This is kind of difficult to do, so I won't expect it. But with the talent that they have landed, I'm not going to be shocked if it happens.
It feels like this could end up at least in that conversation. If even if just 2 of those 3 guys hit, you're talking about Biletnikoff caliber type players, potentially first round draft pick type players eventually. But, the fact that all 3 of them play the same position probably doesn't help. If you have a linebacker and a defensive end and a wide receiver, they're not necessarily going to be stealing stats from each other. 3 wide receivers, there's only one football at a time. So even if all 3 guys end up as multi-year starters, they're, every time you throw it to one, you're not throwing it to the other. So that I think might be one thing that might hold it back from the very top of the list, but it has the potential to be up there, and the Buckeyes could have another good week coming in the next few days. They have at least one target who's expected to announce his decision a little later on this week. We'll have coverage of that a little later on this week. I'm going to try and have Alex Gleitman on the show, talk about that, to kind of do a full recap of the June recruiting period and sort of what's coming up next for Ohio State as they head into what is a dead period on the NCAA recruiting calendar, but should potentially be a very live and active one in terms of actual commitments over the next month or so. So we'll have that. We'll be back to our season preview series. We should have someone on a little later on in the week to talk about one of the Buckeyes' Big Ten opponents, and a lot more coming up later on this week. That is all coming up on the Morning Scoop feed. You'll also have a busy week on the Buckeye Weekly feed. Tony and I will be dropping a new episode on Monday. You can look forward to that. And then we'll have, I'm sure we'll have new coverage from Mark Givler and Bill the Bank Green on Gives in the Bank. A new episode. Kevin Noon just did a long live episode of the Big Me Kickoff podcast. Make sure you check that one out. And of course, Alex Gleitman with his Around the Oval podcast. All fantastic shows. You can find them all wherever you find this. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of them. Thank you guys for joining us. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.